The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am reviewing the Survivor and Neutral cards from In the Clutches of Chaos, the 5th Mythos pack in the Circle Undone cycle. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Before we get started, I would like to thank the patrons of this channel for their tremendous support. The Arkham Horror LCG community is amazing, and these people have gone above and beyond to bring you content like these reviews. If you'd like to become a patron to support the channel's goals and see your name in lights, follow the link down below, sign up for a tier, and claim your reward. That would be awesome. The first Survivor card in the pack is Trial by Fire. It's a 3-cost Survivor event with a wild skill icon and the Spirit trait. It has the game text, fast, play only during your turn, choose one of your skills until the end of your turn, set the base value of that skill to 5. Survivor investigators tend to have 1 or 2 below average base skill values. Ashcan Pete is lacking in the intellect and combat departments, although his faithful Hound Duke does mitigate those shortcomings somewhat. Reedy Young spends more time at the track than the library, while Silas Marsh has spent so much time on his boat that his willpower and intellect have suffered. Wendy Adams has a combat skill of 1 because, well, she's a child, and William York has an intellect skill value of 2. An off-class survivor such as Agnes Baker doesn't do much better with 2s in intellect and combat. And then there's Calvin Wright and Preston Fairmont, who have 0s and 1s across the board. I think you can see a trend here. Survivors and off-class survivors such as Agnes tend to have below-average intellect, which is the most important skill in the game, especially if you play a lot of solo like I do. You can't win the game unless you discover clues, which puts survivors at something of a disadvantage right out of the box. Fortunately, the class has access to cards such as Dark Horse, which boosts their base skill values across the board, Newspaper, which boosts their intellect, Flashlight, which lowers the shroud value of locations, and Look What I Found, which gives survivors a leg up if they do happen to fail an investigate action. Trial by Fire lets survivors and off-class survivors set the base skill value of one of their skills to 5 for an entire turn. As we've seen above, Trial by Fire can be very helpful if survivors need to investigate. They can set their intellect skill value to 5 during the player window at the start of their turn, then attempt to grab a bunch of clues with their 3 actions. If you've got some way of generating additional actions, such as Leo DeLuca or the Ace of Rods from the Circle Undone Deluxe expansion, you can get even more mileage out of Trial by Fire. Trial by Fire is helpful if survivors need to investigate, but truth be told, setting the base value of most skills to 5 is going to come in very handy. For example, if you know Silas Marsh or William York are going to spend their entire turn fighting, Trial by Fire will give them a slight edge during all 3 actions. Toss a weapon into the mix and you're sitting pretty. Playing Trial by Fire on the right turn could end up saving you several cards that you would have otherwise committed to pass those skill tests. Unfortunately, Trial by Fire does have its limits. Survivors and off-class survivors are unlikely to use it to boost their willpower, since you may play Trial by Fire only on your turn, and most willpower skill tests happen during the Mythos phase. I mentioned several investigators who may be interested in Trial by Fire, but I think it will see the most play in Calvin Wright and Preston Fairmont. Both investigators have awful base skill values, so the ability to set one of those base skill values to 5 once or twice a game is going to be a huge boon. Trial by Fire does cost 3 resources, which is a little on the pricey side for most investigators besides Preston Fairmont. Survivors and off-class survivors have received a lot of cards lately, such as Take Heart and Drawing Thin, which help them generate resources. But if you're really concerned about the cost, you could play Trial by Fire in combination with On Your Own, a survivor asset from the City of Archives. On Your Own costs 2 resources and 3 experience points, but you may exhaust it to reduce the cost of an event by 2, making cards such as Trial by Fire much more affordable. It's worth noting that On Your Own doesn't play nice with allies, so if they are an important part of your strategy, you may want to look elsewhere. Trial by Fire is a versatile event that can help survivors shore up obvious weaknesses or give their above-average skills a small boost for a turn. How you use it depends a lot on the investigator that you're playing. On the one hand, many survivors and off-class survivors struggle in the intellect department, so Trial by Fire may help them investigate more efficiently. Wendy Adams, on the other hand, could use it to boost her combat skill, and Calvin Wright and Preston Fairmont could use help in every skill. Trial by Fire is a little pricey, but I think that's less of a concern these days with all of the resource generation that the Survivor class has received lately. The second Survivor card in the pack is the level 3 version of Bait and Switch. It's a 1-cost event that costs 3 experience points. It has 1 intellect and 2 agility skill icons and the tactic trait. It has the following game text: either choose one, evade if you succeed and the enemy is non-elite, evade the enemy and move it to a connecting location, or evade, use only on a non-elite enemy at a connecting location. If you succeed, evade that enemy and switch locations with it. Bait and Switch is one of those cards I tend to forget about. I tested it in a few decks after it was released in the Dunwich Legacy expansion, but it didn't quite pan out the way I expected. While I think the effect is interesting, it costs a card and a resource, and it's limited to non-elite enemies, which isn't ideal. If that enemy happens to have the Hunter keyword, it's going to give chase the following round. That's not great either, since you'll take damage and or horror if it catches you. In those sorts of situations, I'd prefer to keep the Hunter at my location so I can evade it again easily the following turn, rather than feel compelled to move, either to the Hunter's location so I can deal with it again, or to another location further away from the Hunter. Now, there are a few players who have found a use for Bait and Switch in multiplayer. For example, a survivor or off-class survivor may move an enemy into the loving arms of the group's guardian, who can deal with it permanently without having to move to that location themselves. But I play solo most of the time, so if I build an evasion-based deck, I see Bait and Switch, think back to those early tests that I had with the card, and then usually move on to other cards. Bait and Switch has seen some renewed interest since the release of Arkham's latest survivor, Rita Young. Rita's response lets her deal 1 damage to an enemy or move to a connecting location after she evades an enemy. That gives Rita the option to soften up the enemy a little, which could be helpful if another investigator plans on killing it anyway. Alternatively, she can move the enemy to a connecting location and then move herself, putting a great deal of distance between the enemy and herself. Bait and Switch 3 has 2 abilities. The first is the same as its level 0 counterpart. The second lets an investigator evade a non-elite enemy at a connecting location and then switch locations with it. This type of effect would be quite useful in linear scenarios such as the Essex County Express or Lost in Time and Space, or scenarios where you need to return to a location and do some backtracking, such as the Unspeakable Oath, Black Star's Rise, The Doom of Estley, or Heart of the Elders Part 1. If there happens to be an enemy blocking your way to your objectives, Bait and Switch lets you switch places with that enemy and keep on trucking. The effect is even better in Rita Young, since she has the option to switch places with the enemy and then move again, essentially turning one action into a double move. If you're playing multiplayer, you could use Bait and Switch 3 to pull an enemy from a connecting location to the Guardian in the group. Since you evaded the enemy, it would be exhausted, giving the Guardian a turn to deal with the relatively harmless enemy before it was able to launch a counterattack. One of the interesting things I noticed about Bait and Switch 3 is that it's a tactic, while Bait and Switch 0 is a trick. I'm not sure whether this is a mistake or not, but there are only 2 investigators who care about these traits, those being Mark Harrigan and Rita Young. Mark can't play Bait and Switch 3 since it's a level 3 card and he may only play level 0 tactics, while Rita could play Bait and Switch 3 regardless of the trait since it is a survivor card. Bait and Switch 3 is one of those cards that would be nice to have in your toolbox to deal with specific situations, but I wouldn't deem it to be essential. I have my doubts that I would be willing to spend 3 experience points on it unless I was playing Rita Young, who receives additional benefits for evading enemies. The effect is great in linear scenarios or scenarios that force you to backtrack. For example, I would seriously consider it heading into a scenario such as Lost in Time and Space, where the fate of the campaign is on the line. It would also be really useful in the Unspeakable Oath or the Doom of Estley, although it's worth noting that it cannot target the Harbinger of Valusia. Rita could also use Bait and Switch 3 to push an enemy from a connecting location to a Guardian, softening up the enemy in the process. Otherwise, I would probably consider purchasing other upgrades first, because you are basically paying that 3 experience points for an additional icon and that second ability, since the first is the same as the level 0 version. There is only one neutral card in the pack, and it's Anna KASLOW, Mysterious Soothsayer. She's a 3-cost asset that costs 4 experience points. She has a wild skill icon and the ally and clairvoyant traits. While Anna is in play, you have 2 additional tarot slots. She has 2 response triggers. First, when the game begins, if Anna KASLOW is in your opening hand, you get to put her into play. And 2, after Anna KASLOW enters play, search your deck for a tarot asset and put it into play. She has 1 health and 1 sanity and takes up the ally slot. The Circle Undone introduced the tarot slot to the game, but designer Matt Newman hasn't done all that much with it during this cycle, besides the tarot cards and the basic weakness that came in the deluxe expansion. Anna KASLOW, Mysterious Soothsayer changes that in a pretty dramatic way. First, she grants you 2 additional tarot slots for a total of 3. Second, much like the tarot cards themselves, you get to put her into play for free if she is in your starting hand. And third, once she enters play, Anna lets you search your deck for a tarot asset and put it into play, immediately filling one of those tarot slots. Obviously, there is the makings of a deck archetype here, although it's not entirely clear to me whether tarot decks will be any good, for reasons I'll discuss in a moment. Ideally, if you're playing a tarot deck, you'll want Anna and at least 2 tarot assets in your opening hand, so you'll be able to fill all 3 of your tarot slots before the game begins. You need only 2 tarot assets in your opening hand, since Anna will grab you the 3rd with her response. The tarot assets themselves are non-unique, so you can double up on them if you happen to pull both copies of, say, Death 13. There are a couple of ways you can improve the odds of assembling this ideal starting hand. The easiest way is to simply mulligan very aggressively. An aggressive mulligan will let you see the top 10 cards of your deck, slightly more if you happen to draw a weakness or 2 along the way. The second is to play an investigator such as SEFINA Rousseau, who draws 13 cards for her opening hand. If SEFINA plays her cards right, she could begin the game with Anna KASLOW and a mixture of the Moon, 18, or the 4 of Cups in play. Starting the game with a willpower or agility of 6 is a very nice perk. The only potential problem I see with this plan is that SEFINA's signature event, the Painted World, deals exclusively with events, so finding the right balance between events and the tarot assets may take some experimentation. The third option is to play an investigator who can purchase Studious, the Seeker asset in this Mythos pack that lets you begin the game with 1 additional card in your opening hand. Studious is non-unique, so you could potentially begin each game with an opening hand of 7 cards, which would certainly improve your odds of drawing Anna and a couple of tarot assets. Obviously, this strategy is limited to Seekers and Lola Hayes. Lola Hayes may be the ideal investigator for the tarot archetype, since she may purchase all of the tarot assets, as well as Anna KASLOW and Studious. It's worth noting that Lola also has access to a lot of the Seeker draw cards, which I think will be important, especially if you're dropping Anna and a couple of tarot assets down on the table right off the bat. Your hand is going to be, you're not going to have many cards in your hand left in your hand after that, so being able to restock your hand quickly will be important. While the tarot deck archetype is certainly viable, I can see a few potential problems with it. The biggest issue that I have is with the nature of the tarot cards themselves. Most cards that provide skill value bonuses have additional abilities that are good, if not better, than the bonus itself. Beat Cop and Peter Sylvester are good examples of this type of design philosophy. Don't get me wrong, +1 combat or +1 agility and +1 willpower are great, but the ability to ping an enemy for 1 damage without making a skill test, or soak 1 horror turn after turn are simply incredible. Those types of abilities make a huge impact on the board state long after the card hits the table. I'd be willing to argue the special abilities on the tarot assets aren't quite as good as those cards, such as Beat Cop or Peter Sylvester, because they're very front-loaded. That is, they resolve before the game even begins. Playing a card for free without spending an action is a very good ability, but it doesn't have the potential to affect the board state down the road like those other cards can. Moreover, unless you draw a tarot asset in your opening hand, you get nothing besides the skill value bonus. That can make the tarot assets feel somewhat underwhelming unless you draw them in your opening hand. Another potential problem with the tarot deck archetype is the price tag, both in terms of experience and card slots. Anna KASLOW costs 4 experience points. Each tarot card will set you back 1 experience point. Assuming that you're playing Anna and 2 sets of tarot assets, you're looking at a minimum of 12 experience points and 6 card slots. Adding Studious into the mix brings the price tag to 18 if you're playing both copies of Studious. That's quite a bit of experience to spend on a package that lets you have a very explosive beginning of the game, but provides very few abilities that are useful in the mid to late game. The third problem that I have with the tarot archetype is that it's extremely fragile. Anna KASLOW has only 1 health and 1 sanity, making her vulnerable to not only damage and or horror, but also ally and asset hate, such as Crypt Chill from the core set, among other cards that have been released in various Mythos packs. And if Anna goes down, you can kiss those 2 tarot slots and pretty much your entire strategy goodbye. If you've got access to the Guardian card pool, you could play Trusted to boost Anna's health and sanity, but again, that's 2 more card slots you're dedicating to the tarot strategy. If you go that route, you've dedicated nearly a third of your deck to a strategy that is really subject to diminishing returns after you draw your opening hand. I think a potential fourth problem is the fact that if you do drop Anna and 2 tarot assets down on the table without having a card like Studious in play, you're only going to have 2 cards in your opening hand, so you're either going to need to draw aggressively to replenish your hand or play some of the draw cards in order to restock, and the only class that really has access to a lot of great draw is the Seeker class. If you're interested in exploiting the tarot cards from the Circle Undone, Anna KASLOW is the soothsayer for you. Dropping Anna and 3 tarot cards on the table before a scenario even begins is the dream, but I'm not convinced the strategy is worth the experience or the card slots. Lola Hayes might be able to make a tarot deck work, but Anna herself is extremely fragile. Asset and ally hate are fairly common, and 1 bad draw is likely to kill Anna. And if Anna goes, she takes her tarot cards with her. That's too much of a risk for too little reward in my book. That's going to do it for my review of the Survivor and Neutral cards from In the Clutches of Chaos. Trial by Fire is the best of the bunch here. The card has already made the cut in a bunch of decks over at Arkham DB for obvious reasons. All survivors and off-class survivors have below-average base skill values, and Trial by Fire fixes that problem, at least for a turn. It can even give investigators with above-average skill values a slight edge for a turn if you're able to take all 3 actions using that skill. Bait and Switch 3 has the ability that is useful in linear scenarios or scenarios that require a lot of backtracking. Rita Young is all over evasion cards, so she may take a liking to it. Personally, I'm not convinced that it's worth the 3 experience points for an extra skill icon and that extra ability. And finally, there's Anna KASLOW. This soothsayer is the cornerstone of the tarot deck archetype. Unfortunately, she's a very fragile cornerstone who doesn't have much in the way of tricks after that explosive opening hand. Perhaps we will see some cards down the road that will make the tarot deck archetype more viable. But right now, I think it's going to be more of a curiosity than something that's going to be a tier 1 strategy. That's going to do it for this review. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.